and welcome to the seminar entitled Institutionality of Chilean Mining in the International Context. This is the main event of Cesco Week Santiago 2021. The last time we saw each other face to face was actually on April 10th in the evening, 2019, at the Cesco dinner. Now, if my memory serves me well, I recall that the keynote speaker back then invited us to listen to a conversation on literacy for futures. Now, this is a discipline that several decades ago started assessing our development and our capacity building and trying to be in advance of what is going to occur in order to better face the challenges we face. Now, back then, we had a feeling that the world was on the verge of facing major, profound challenges, but we never imagined that it would come so quickly. Following that, Chile went through this period of social unrest that brought about a plebiscite that was actually adopted by an overwhelming majority with regard to drafting a new constitution by way of this constituent assembly. And then in 2020, early 2020, COVID appeared, and the rest is history. We all know the rest. Now, this version is version number 24 of Cesco Week, and this is occurring in the midst of a sanitary crisis in Chile and around the world. And also, we know that there's a great deal of change. We're on the verge of an era of change as a result of this environmental crisis and very sad levels of inequality and issues with regards to institutions. Now, this technical revolution, is unfolding as well. And the economy is quickly moving towards decarbonization as well as geopolitical changes. Mining, just like other economic sectors, is having to face these challenges and tackle them. These are unprecedented, but at the same time, there are great opportunities that lie within. And if we are able to rise to the challenge, we hope that we will be doing this with success. Now, the seminar today tries to provide a contribution to this debate, of course, while we're on the verge of this constituent assembly. And as part of a commitment, Cesco's commitment to provide an opportunity for dialogue, a sincere moment of dialogue that we can all sit down and listen to the various perspectives with regard to our society. Now, when we came up with this idea, we knew that we hadn't had the draft law for a 3% royalty on sales, and we are sure that this conversation will provide us with a constructive approach to addressing the contribution of mining and long-term contribution to society. Now, this is something that we actually understand that is marked and framed by the legitimate interest of the country to maximize the returns that the country receives from mining activity, both in terms of tax revenue as well as in terms of the virtuous cycle and various chains involved therein. Now, of course, it's key to ensure that this is compatible with our level of competitiveness and the destination of the investments required to better develop the country and the sector. Now, prior to introducing you to our keynote speaker today, I would just like to express my sincere appreciation to all the individuals who have provided support and companies, Anglo American, Antofagasta Minerals, BHP, and Freeport-McMoRan. Just a few brief announcements. During the seminar, we will be receiving questions by way of the WhatsApp on screen. We would like to request that you please state your name and the organization you represent. At the same time, we would like to request that you use the hashtag CescoWeek2021 for all your social media communication. Moreover, I would like to reiterate that we have simultaneous interpretation services available. And now I would like to give the floor to our keynote speaker, James Otto. Jim is his nickname. He has university degrees in law, engineering, and mineral economics. He has a wealth of academic experience and as a consultant as well in the mining industry for more than 40 years. He has worked for numerous customers in more than 60 countries, including governments, the private sector, multilateral agencies, educational institutions, etc. His area of expertise, in fact, includes legislation applied to natural resources, public policy, mining sector taxation, risk analysis for countries, sustainable development, and alleviating poverty that is the result of natural resources. So, James, I would like to welcome you and give you the floor.
Thank you, Alejandra. Well, we have all read about the civil unrest that occurred in Chile which led to calls for systematic regulatory reform. Critics of the current system say it does not adequately provide for today's society, and this has led to a national debate about the regulatory system. As was mentioned, in October last year, voters voted to support replacing the Constitution. The Constitution addresses matters relating to natural resources, and its replacement could affect the mining sector. The law that deals with mining is almost 40 years old now, and while the system has been amended, the fundamental approach has remained about the same. A question for lawmakers is, with the creation of the new Constitution, should the mining sector regulatory and fiscal systems be updated? As was mentioned earlier, I'm a mining lawyer and a mineral economist, and I've worked with many nations in drafting mining laws and am familiar with the strengths and weaknesses of various approaches. Likewise, I've advised many governments on mining sector fiscal matters, including most of the world's leading copper producers. Mining laws and fiscal systems in all nations evolve to reflect increased knowledge about the resource endowment, the changing expectations of society and investors, and the realities of international markets. While demands for change can be influenced by what is happening internationally, whether or not a change should be made in Chile needs to take into account the unique needs of Chile. I'm not an expert in Chilean legislation or taxation, and have not been commissioned to do any sort of detailed analysis. My intent today is to make high-level observations based on my international experience that may be useful when thinking about what reforms might be considered. In my talk, I will briefly address the following subjects. First, the importance of transparency. Is there a best practice approach to how mining rights are allocated? What is the use it or lose it principle, and how can it be applied? Should Chile change its approaches to mine taxation? What are the options for sustainable development? And is downstream value addition important? So my first topic is the importance of transparency. There is a trend among mineral producing nations to provide public transparency about the mining sector. There are a lot of public misconceptions about the mining industry that arise from a lack of accessible and verifiable information. For example, are mining companies paying a fair share? How much do they pay? And what does the government do with the money it collects? Another example is sometimes there's a perception that just a few mining companies control all the concessions and they influence government to preserve the status quo. In Chile, there's a lot of public information about the mining sector available from various sources, but for a layperson, obtaining and assimilating such information can be very impractical. Today, there's an international standard that can be used to ensure broad transparency called the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI. To become an EITI member, a country has to agree to comply with the standard. It's a common set of rules governing what has to be disclosed and when and how. An international board monitors and assesses each member country in meeting the requirements of the standard. Today, 55 mineral producing nations take part in the initiative, but Chile does not. Chile could consider joining the EITI and implementing the transparency standard. An increasing number of nations are including EITI participation requirements in their mining codes. In most of the recent codes I assisted to draft, EITI reporting requirements were integrated into both the mining code and the regulations. My next topic is there a best practice approach to how mining rights are allocated? Examples of different allocation approaches include concessions, or their equivalent licenses and leases, negotiated mining agreements, service contracts, and auctions. In many countries, including Chile, different regulatory approaches are used to allocate mining rights depending on the type of mineral, the scale of operation, and so forth. I will restrict my comments today to just the regulation of large-scale metal mines. I've examined the mining rights allocations in the 12 largest copper producing nations. One nation uses an auction system. One nation uses a system where a party registers as an explorer. If it finds a deposit, it submits a discovery report. The reserves and resources are then confirmed by the state. Then an exploitation authorization is issued. One nation uses a first come, first served unified concession system where a concession includes both exploration and exploitation rights. Three nations use a combination of auctions and first come, first served two-phase system. 4 countries use a first come, first served two-phase system. And 2 countries use a variety of different approaches, either a first come, first served two-phase system or a claims registration system. Now, what does this tell us about the 12 big copper producers? If you've got good resources, regardless of the way that mining rights are allocated, you can develop a world-class mining industry. As we can see, the most prevalent approach for copper producers is a first come, first served direct application system that has separate authorizations for exploration and for exploitation, like in Chile. The use of auctions is also common, is becoming more popular worldwide, but usually it's used as a parallel approach to the first come, first served two-phase approach. The use of negotiated mining agreements is now very rare, and none of the major copper producing nations use them for new mines. The use of service contracts, where a private company is hired to mine a deposit for the state, has almost disappeared. The process for applying for mining authorization varied greatly in the 12 jurisdictions, ranging from an application through the courts to applying to a mines department to registering a claim with a land office. All of these approaches work. The use of auctions can be used as an important way to complement two-phase direct application systems. And I'm going to briefly describe this because it may be something Chile would like to more fully develop. Auction systems are used by many countries for allocating oil and gas exploration blocks, but until recently, auctions were not common for non-carbon minerals. This has changed, and many nations now provide an auction option in addition to direct application. The auction option can be used where the state has reason to believe that a particular area is endowed with mineable minerals. By offering an area for auction, the state can immediately benefit from an upfront bonus payment. I'll give an example from Mexico, which has both a direct application system and an auction system, both of which are very successful. In Mexico, land can be reserved by the Geological Survey for up to 2 years. The GS does work on the area to increase knowledge about the minerals, which will increase its value for auction. The Geological Survey can let the reserve lapse after 2 years or hold an auction. Pre-qualified bidders compete in 3 rounds of open bidding, and the area goes to the highest bidder, who then pays a bonus to the government, after which an exploitation concession is granted. I've included the auction option in all the recent codes I've drafted. In a minute, I'm going to talk about use it or lose it principles. If Chile implements use it or lose it principles, many current concessions in Chile might become available for auctioning. This may be a good time for Chile to consider creating a parallel auction system to complement its two-phase concession system. The mining law already has articles that deal with auctions in the case of a concession holder not paying annual fees, and these auction provisions could be easily expanded. I would like to now comment on the current Chilean mining law and the use it or lose it principle. And I would like to begin by complimenting the Chilean mining law. It has been highly successful in regulating the development of one of the world's largest mining industries. However, every mining code can be improved by identifying what is or is not working well. Many governments that undertake mining law reform first do a comprehensive review, including a gap analysis to guide their reform effort. For example, when I assist a government with reforming its mining law, we start with a very detailed analysis of over 100 questions to identify strengths and weaknesses in gaps. I have not done an in-depth analysis of the Chilean mining code, but I have identified one very important topic that could be addressed in a reform effort, and these are the use it or lose it requirements. There are other topics that I could talk about that would improve Chilean mining law, but given my time allocation today, I'm just going to stick to the use it or lose it issue. Use it or lose it is a phrase that became popular at the end of the apartheid period in South Africa. A handful of mining firms there controlled most of the prospective ground, holding it for their own future use or holding it to deny access to their competitors. But little ground that wasn't held by the big mining companies was mostly held by speculators hoping to sell their rights to other companies. The state introduced a new constitution and mining law that required companies either to use their concessions now or lose them. And the rationale behind use it or lose it is that if minerals belong to the state, it is in the interest of the state to see that they are developed efficiently and sooner rather than later. Almost all newer mining codes contain use it or lose it requirements. Chile's mining code has no meaningful use it or lose it requirements. As long as a nominal annual payment per unit area is paid, the holder can retain an exploitation concession. In countries without use it or lose it requirements, over time, a lot of land becomes subject to unproductive concessions. In Chile, most prospective ground is under concession, and on most of this area, little or no activity occurs year after year. Most of the highest potential undeveloped area is held by about 10 companies who have no plans to immediately begin mining it. In many countries, a lot of successful greenfields exploration is done by juniors. The problem in Chile is that juniors can't get concession area because prospective ground is all tied up in existing concessions that are not being currently developed. If Chile desires to see its state-owned mineral resources explored and mined sooner rather than later, it could adopt use it or lose it measures. There are many types of well-tested use it or lose it requirements that could be introduced. For exploration concessions, the four most common use it or lose it approaches include an approved annual work plan and budget, escalating fees per unit area, progressive periodic relinquishment, and escalating per unit area expenditure requirements. Currently, Chile has an antiquated 2-year plus 2-year renewal system for exploration concessions. 4 years is much too short a period for finding below surface ore bodies, and modern mining codes usually provide at least 10 years. Chile could consider moving to a system that has a longer exploration concession term, but that imposes use it or lose it requirements to ensure that if exploration is not done on a continuous and substantial basis, the concession is automatically canceled. This would almost certainly increase the level of exploration in Chile. Chile could also consider much stricter requirements to acquire an exploitation concession to avoid the situation where an exploration concession is prematurely converted to an exploitation concession. For example, to acquire an exploitation concession could require confirmation of exploitable mineable reserves, meeting Cesco type reporting standards, a feasibility study, and an approved EIA. At the present time, Chile has an amazing number of exploitation concessions that are not in production. The most common use it or lose it approach to ensure that an exploitation concession is brought into production is to impose a deadline, such as a time period by which the holder must commence construction or production. Failure to meet the deadline results in cancellation. Many newer mining codes also provide that if production ceases for a defined time period, the concession is canceled. Even the most casual analysis of the situation in Chile indicates that the huge land area held in unproductive concessions is a problem. My fourth topic is the fiscal system. Should Chile change its approach to mine taxation? Is the government's objective to maximize tax revenues from every project by squeezing out every possible peso each year? Or is its goal to maximize overall fiscal take by applying lower taxes and attracting new investors, thus increasing the size of the long-term tax base? There's always friction between balancing these two objectives. Historically, Chile has implemented tax policies which favored growing the size of the tax base, but this has changed in recent years. 25 years ago, there was a so-called race to the bottom as countries lowered their tax take in order to compete for investment. Those days are over. Today, many governments strive to create a system that grows the size of the tax base while imposing a reasonable tax burden on mining operations. What is a reasonable tax burden today? One measure that I use in my work and that I see mentioned in the Chilean press is effective tax rate. For those of you that are not economists, ETR is a way to express the tax burden of a mine in a single number that can be compared to the tax burden of a similar mine in another jurisdiction. An undiscounted ETR of 40 to 50% for a mine is typical in copper producing nations. Usually, when advising nations, most governments request that I recommend approaches that will yield a 50% ETR for an average mine. Generally, if the rate is much above 50% for copper mines, the objective of growing the tax base will be diminished because investors may invest elsewhere and marginal mines will not be built. But if the rate is below 40%, the government take may not generate reasonable fiscal revenues. I haven't recently modeled Chile's tax system, but others have. There are several new studies that I have read that estimate the ETR for a typical copper mine in Chile is in the range of 40 to 50%. Unfortunately, these studies didn't contain enough detail for me to really comment on their accuracy, but it is reassuring to know that the general ETR range sounds encouraging. Today, there is great similarity in mining tax systems from nation to nation. Most nations apply the general tax system, but with special treatment of various deductions and credits for the income tax. Plus, they impose several additional taxes, usually a unit area fee, a royalty, and more rarely an excess profits tax. Most countries assess some type of royalty, and there are three main types. Most nations apply an ad valorem royalty calculated as a percent of the mineral value. For bulk minerals, such as coal, some countries apply a unit-based royalty based on a set amount per unit volume or weight. Other jurisdictions use a net operating income approach, such as some Australian, Canadian, and US states, and Chile and Peru. In nations where minerals belong to the state, such as in Chile, most nations do not use the net operating income royalty approach on its own. And why is this? Well, the miner is removing a non-renewable, state-owned natural resource, and the state needs to receive something in return, regardless of whether the mining is making profits in that year. Net operating income type taxes do not guarantee a payment each year. Royalty types are not mutually exclusive. For example, in Peru, it has a net operating income type tax very similar to Chile's, but it applies an ad valorem royalty when annual net operating income is negative. When prices go up, so does the political pressure to increase the government's take. We can all remember the last commodity supercycle when the prices for many minerals soared. During the last supercycle, there was a renewed interest in excess profits tax approaches. For example, Australia, Chile, Ghana, PNG, Liberia, Mongolia, Peru, Zambia, all implemented taxes that sought higher payments in times of higher profits. In Chile, since 2006, a specific tax has been levied on large copper producers that has excess profits tax characteristics. It is a tax on net operating income with a variable rate between 5 and 14%, depending on the operational margin of the mine in a given year. This is a very well-intentioned tax and one that I often model for governments that are seeking to revise their fiscal systems. For those of you that have paid this tax, you know the calculation of the specific tax is very complicated. And if the tax is retained, the calculation could be made much simpler. In Chile, I'm told the specific tax goes to the general fund and can't be earmarked for special purposes. This is typical in most countries that levy some form of excess profits tax. I've been reading articles in Chile's press about the fiscal system, and the press has posted a number of questions for Chile's lawmakers. Should the tax on mining be increased? Should the specific tax be replaced by a royalty on production or revenue? Should the tax system capture a higher proportion of excess profits during periods of high commodity prices? With regard to the question, should Chile change its approach to mine taxation, my advice is as follows. Don't jump to action. Any mining sector fiscal system proposals should be carefully modeled, studied, and analyzed. Bills introduced to the Congress should first be vetted by the ministries responsible for economy and finance, by the tax authority, and by industry. In analyzing the mining tax system, a holistic approach is necessary, and there are a number of factors that could be considered. The first would be the combined impact of all taxes, not just to focus on one type of tax, such as a royalty. The ability to adjust for periods of high and low prices. The impact on marginal mines' ability to pay. The administrative complexity and enforceability of the system. The vulnerability to transfer pricing. Application to companies operating more than one mine, ring fencing. The timing of tax payments over the life of the mine, depreciation, loss carry forward. Fiscal stabilization, the use of incentives to attract exploration, and of course, the potential impact on mining sector investment. The government can model a variety of different taxes to study their pros and cons. For example, I did this in Peru in 2002 and in 2011 before they modified their system. The first time by introducing an ad valorem royalty, and the second time by introducing a specific tax on mining. In Peru, the Ministry of Economy, the Tax Authority, congressional committees, lawmakers, industry, and others all had a solid basis prepared by a neutral expert to judge the pros and cons of each possible reform measure. The good news is that all the forecasts that I read project that the demand for metals, including copper, will continue to grow for at least the next 30 years, providing Chile with the opportunity to collect mining sector taxes for many decades. And I would now like to shift to the topic of sustainable development. Minerals are a non-renewable resource, and once mined out, that source of economic benefits disappear, and other means must be found to sustain the economy. Even a resource-rich country such as Chile will eventually see the contribution from mining decline. There are three main ways that are used today to address sustained development. These are not mutually exclusive, and each approach can lead to positive outcomes. One way is to encourage exploration, to find new mineral deposits to replace those that are depleted. I've already talked about one way to encourage exploration by implementing a use it or lose it policy. A second way to promote sustainable development is to diversify the economy. With regard to the second approach, such diversification can be both miner-led and government-led, and can be both local and national. Miner-led sustainable development has historically been voluntary and centered on local corporate social responsibility programs determined by the miner. However, this is changing, and the mining codes in many countries now require a miner to help affected local communities toward a goal of sustainable development. In a 2017 paper, I wrote for the UN, I identified about 40 nations that now legally require some sort of miner-led local community development. For those that are interested, the World Bank has published a 3-volume handbook on community development agreements, including 1 volume I authored containing model regulations that can be adopted as part of a mining law. Government-led sustainable development is often accomplished by creating an investment environment conducive to investing in non-mining sectors, infrastructure, human capital, and so forth. Chile has enjoyed good success with diversifying its economy. For example, the service sector, agriculture, forestry, and tourism. The contribution of mining to Chile's GDP is currently about 9 or 10%, down from about 16% a decade ago. A third way that a country can address sustainable development is through the use of a sovereign wealth fund designed to ensure that future generations benefit from minerals mined by yesterday's and today's mines. A sovereign wealth fund is a state-owned fund that receives its capital partially from today's fiscal revenues and partially from its annual earnings on investments. Such funds are very common in mineral-rich countries today, and over 70 funds now exist or are in the planning stage. Chile has 2 sovereign wealth funds, the Economic and Social Stabilization Fund and the Pension Reserve Fund. Neither of these funds is specifically designed to provide intergenerational and future revenue streams that will replace fiscal revenues from mining when the industry one day winds down. Chile has gained a lot of experience with its 2 funds. In the future, it may want to consider a sovereign wealth fund dedicated to long-term sustained income. In answering the question, should Chile change its approach to sustainable development, care must be taken. Chile has enjoyed great success in diversifying its economy. However, there are additional tools that it could consider, such as looking at ways that communities located near to mines can better prepare for the time when a mine closes, and could consider a sovereign wealth fund. My final subject is downstream value addition. Chile has a substantial copper smelting and refining industry, and in terms of volume, it's usually ranked 2 or 3 in the world. However, this is probably not sustainable. 4 of Chile's 7 smelters and 3 of its refineries are ranked among the 10 least competitive facilities in the world. Why these high cost and technically obsolete facilities have not closed is a bit of a mystery to me. Perhaps the answer is related to national value chain objectives. It is a goal of many mineral producing nations to not only mine raw minerals, but to develop downstream industries that produce final metals and products manufactured from those metals. For example, a country with copper mines may want to export metal and motors, not just concentrate. In Chile, the percentage of copper exported as metal has been decreasing. In 2011, 38% was exported as metal, and projections show that this may fall to just 12% by 2025. This shift is attributed to more sulfide and less oxide ore being mined and the lack of new smelting capacity. Worldwide, profit margins for smelters and refineries are typically very small. Highly efficient smelters may see a margin of around, say, 3 to 5%. Chile's margins are often reported as negative. Because processing profitability is so low, most nations do not require local processing and leave it to the market to decide where processing will take place. If Chile wants to maintain or grow its capacity to produce copper metal, it will need to replace or upgrade its obsolete high-cost smelters and refineries and add refining capability at those smelters that don't have it. And what about manufacturing? For example, producing motors, generators, telecoms, and so forth. Are the disadvantages of local processing offset by the advantages provided by increased manufacturing potential? And what should the role of government be? Leave it to the market? Legally require downstream downstream processing, create disincentives for exporting concentrates, such as imposing a duty or levying a high royalty on concentrate, impose import duties on manufactured copper products, provide tax credits or other incentives to encourage manufacturing industries, provide tax incentives to energy industries that could lead to lower energy costs, thus making Chilean smelters and refineries more profitable. Chile is well aware of these options. Of course, what is best for copper may not apply to other minerals. For example, raw lithium is very common and doesn't command a high price. But lithium batteries are scarce and do command a high price. A downstream value chain policy for one mineral may be quite different than that for another. Well, this is the end of my presentation. I would like to conclude by saying that this is an important time for Chile. It has successfully built a world-class mining industry that has enabled it to expand its economy and join the League of High-Income Countries. It's been almost 40 years since the current mining law was introduced, and while the system has been very successful, there are ways it can be improved. Chileans know the strengths and weaknesses of the current regulatory and fiscal system, and given the tremendous pool of talent here in Chile, I'm confident that any reform effort will be for the better. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, James, por tu completa charla llena de insights.
Thank you, James. Thank you for the insights, very appropriate for the discussion we will hold later on. Now, I'd like to offer the floor to the panel that accepted this invitation to discuss the topics presented by James. I will not dwell on their bios because it's already available. I'd like to greet Pilar Asbun, a lawyer, a coordinator of the Instituto Libertad de Desarrollo legislative program. I'd like to welcome Rodrigo Valdez, an economist, former Minister of Finance and academician at Universidad Católica and Universidad de Chile. I'd like to greet Claudia Sangüesa, an economist, director of the Institute of Public Policy at Universidad de York, Ben Jones, economist and consulting manager at CRU, and Juan Ignacio Guzman, general manager of Gestión y Economía Minera consulting firm and member of Cesco. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Each one of you will have 10 minutes for a brief presentation in order to comment Mr. Otto's presentation, and then we'll go for a second round, and we will be joined by James. 5 minutes each to then go to the questions coming from the audience. So let's start with Pilar Hasbun. Thank you, Alejandra, and I'd like to thank Cesco for the invitation. I'm going to share a very brief presentation. Can you see it? Okay, so thank you. I agree with Alejandra. Very thorough presentation by Mr. Otto. I'd like to cover in this brief presentation the constitutional framework and juridic or legal framework of mining in Chile and connected to the challenges or those aspects that we should keep in the new constitution facing this constituent process that is happening in Chile. The constitutional framework we know is made up basically by three absolutely necessary bodies, which is the Republic's political constitution, the constitutional law for mining concessions, the mining code, and also supplemented by the mining code, and also the influence here, the Decree 600 regarding foreign investment that was abolished. And then in 2015, a new law was enacted that sets a new regime for foreign investment. What are the base rules that are part of the legal framework for mining in Chile? First of all, we have Article 19, number 24 of the Constitution. Article 19 regulates the right to property as part of the fundamental guarantees. And in this article, that considers the regulation about mining, starting with a general rule, which is that the state has absolute dominion and exclusive over all mines. And of course, considering the ownership of holders of the land. The second one, Constitution sets that there's a concession system for exploration and exploitation that are made up by illegal resolution. And I'd like to comment on that, try to highlight the importance for it to be a constitution and also the extension of these concessions because of a legal ruling. The fact that it's courts of justice are the ones that determine whether the concession is constituted or not. That prevents discretionality that the state may incur because courts must only check whether the requirements are met in order to assign a concession, or maybe if there's any cause for the extension of that concession. This guarantee, I believe, is fundamental, facing as the new constitution. And regarding this,
the Constitution also states that, well, there's the organic law that defines the duration, rights, and responsibilities of the concession holder. So with regard to the duration of the concession, obviously it's the constitutional organic law that defines these, and it is actually undefined for mining concessions, exploitation concessions. With regard to exploration concessions, the duration cannot be more than 4 years, and this is in keeping with the organic law, but then you have the mine code that also says it's 2 years, 2 plus 2. And also the indefinite duration for exploitation concessions clearly provides key guarantees for the investors when they require guarantees for this type of activity, because these are activities regarding long-term approaches and investments. And there's another aspect that governs the organic law on mining concessions. I'm referring to a license protection system, permit protection system. It's yet another guarantee. We know that the Constitution states that the concession makes it necessary for the holder to carry out activities that are of public interest as defined by the concession grant. And this is what is established under the concession. And this protection mechanism defined by law will also directly or indirectly refer to the need for that responsibility to be upheld, and provides for potential extinction or elimination of this if the obligations are not met. This is something that is provided, this guarantee, through a license or permit. Now, in this regard, the law was based on this permit-based protection. And when this was defined, there are historic reasons for this, of course. And in the end, a protection system provides certain disadvantages. For example, it is arbitrary, it may have certain discretional levels for certain parties. And obviously, the fact that you have a permit-based protection system, I believe that's a simpler mechanism that allows us to avoid discretional aspects, discretional application. Now, this is something beneficial both from the state's perspective and the individual holders' perspectives. This is something that will be discussed during the Constitutional Assembly, of course. Maybe what is likely that we will be discussing the obligation enshrined under the Constitution, the obligation for the concession holder to carry out activities that are in the interest of the public. And we will discuss whether or not this is sufficient, if the permit that is sufficient to do that, or if we will have to introduce new obligations for the concession holders. Obviously, this calls for a debate to explore the various aspects. And at the same time, let me mention that any type of obligation that is imposed and legally, this should be under the legal framework, not under the Constitution, by the way, in my opinion, should take into consideration the risks for the mining activities, for investments, and this is something that we must never lose from sight. There are other guarantees with regard to the expiration, and these are defined upon granting the concession. That's another option, that's another guarantee. And then, of course, protecting the property rights of the concession holders, their rights over their land titles. Now, obviously, the concession holder has the right to hold the property, and this allows for the full use of all of the substances and the wealth therein. And the rights state that the state cannot intervene unless through expropriation, and that is only in the case of damage to the national heritage. Now, Article 19, number 24, also refers to non-concessionable substances, and they state that the state can mine these, exploit these through state companies or through special contracts or special agencies. Now, this was about Article 19, number 24, but there are other key regulations that have also allowed us to provide a framework of certainty for the mining industry in Chile. The first one, Pilar, you only have 2 minutes left. Thank you for that, Alejandro. One of these additional guarantees is the equal distribution of taxes and non-discriminatory tax law. The second one is the non-discriminatory arbitrary guarantee with regard to treatment by that the state needs to provide. And then there's this other stability with regard to the foreign investment system that provides a framework for foreign direct investment that creates the institutional arrangements applicable. And then there's other non-discrimination aspects with regard to the legal regime. These are several guarantees. Now, just let me conclude by saying this is a robust framework and that has special characteristics applicable to the sector. And obviously, it's not just about the geological nature of Chile per se or the wealth of these natural resources that have allowed for the mining industry to develop, but rather the having clear-cut rules of the game and sound institutional arrangements have also given way to this robust sector. Let me conclude that with regard to the content and the challenges of the new constitution and new legislation, obviously we must maintain the current constitutional regulations based on concession systems that are defined by court rulings, sound protection for property rights of the concession holders and their land titles, and a system of permit-based protection. And then also we referred to how can we ensure that the sector contributes to sustainable development? Well, I think that is key. That is essential. If you have environmental regulations obviously may bring about disincentive for investment, and we have to need to ensure that it is compatible with sustainable development. But we've also seen in Chile, there are certain legislative incentives. The glacier protection law, for example, is such a protection-based approach that is actually counterproductive to developing the mining industry, and in the end will result in disincentive for the mining industry. And then finally, there needs to be taxation rules that will bring about a balance between competitiveness of the sector and the expected benefits from the country. And I agree with Jim, regardless of the type of taxation approach, one needs to conduct a very in-depth review of the experiences out there prior to acting and making a decision. So things need to be well thought out. I apologize for speaking so quickly. Allow me to now give the floor to Rodrigo Valdez. Thank you very much. Good morning, Alejandra. Good morning, fellow panel members. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you, Jim, for a riveting presentation that provided a wealth of content and food for thought for this discussion in Chile. And I think that is something we truly need here in Chile so that we can raise the level, the bar of our discussion. Now, I would like to refer to 3 key aspects that Jim mentioned, but Pilar also referred to, and allow me to first talk about the constitutional aspects. We know that this is a source of greater uncertainty, or is it when compared to the taxation system? That's a good question. And then let me talk about how urgent it is to have a shared assessment, a shared review. So what do I mean by that? Well, today we have a discussion that is taking place on an extremely broad playing field where we do not hold all the key pieces of information. And I also wanted to refer to that aspect, which would be the shared review. And let me, before that, refer to a few key taxation instruments before delving into the meat of my remarks. Let me begin with the Constitution. And here I would just like to show you a few key slides that go to the heart of the matter. Essentially, I believe there are not a lot of dangers in these changes. There's not a great deal of risk because today, in the end, what we have is what dates back to the reform of 1971. This was a constitutional reform of the 1925 Constitution. And then we hear issues such as we need to nationalize mining. Mining is already somewhat nationalized. I mean, there are concessions provided, but there needs to be a continuity there is continuity with regard to what the 25 Constitution and the 71 reform says and what we should do now. Now, we know that the state, it's been stated that the state has absolute dominion and exclusive inalienable rights. This was in keeping with the Allende reform. And if you continue moving forward and assessing this, you will see that the old Constitution states that the law will determine, out of the minerals, that is, the law will determine which mining areas are subject to concession. And for example, it does not apply to hydrocarbons for some reason. And then there's a significant continuity here.
The Constitution of 1925 that the concessionary had to be protected, and therefore it was a bit of an inheritance, and President Allende signed that. What I'd like to mention, because this is somehow connected to the organic law, is that the concession states our constitution forces the owner to develop activities that are necessary to meet public interests that justify the granting of that concession. My impression is that the law does not reflect, there's more room, I would say, to reflect this. That's food for thought, I believe. But bottom line, in my presentation, I believe there's little risk of a brutal change. Another project that was submitted by President Bachelet at the end of her term did not change a single comma in the whole constitutional regime. Having said this, we have several topics that we need to cover. There's a certain perception of how much is share of this mining rent that I'd like to discuss later on. And just let me tell you in that regard that mining is very different. And we know that these are charts of how the GDP is broken down, the rest of the economy, and between 2011 and 18, and for mining, between what remuneration, for example, and what the capital gains are. And what happens in mining is that in a year of very good prices, or poor prices, or relatively poor prices, capital takes everything because there's intense activity in terms of it's an industry that is extremely capital intensive. So it is normal that much of what is produced actually is skewed to capital. But there's one part, a small part, we don't know how much, which could be mining rent. And what is this rent? Well, this is something that in theory, it's a sort of an excess or a surplus. And basically, as Andrea Guzman said in a column that I found remarkable on what Pilar said, she talked about the protection of private property, but when the owner is the state or all of us, because we hear a lot about property but when it's only private, but not when the state is the owner. How do we protect then that property? So that is a discussion that is very strong today. And as Jim said, we need to be extremely careful when doing it. A couple of points here. When we talk about taxation on the mining industry in Chile, we compare it to Australia, which is with high taxes in the world context. So we see that taxation through corporate taxation is not that different. It is there are years in which it is low in Chile, sometimes or other years it's higher in Australia. 8% of the mining GDP. The GDP for mining is well accounted for. It's 8%, which is approximately 10% in Chile and Australia of the total. Well, it's broken down in this way. There's a couple of years, strange years, unfortunately. I was a minister back then, where there was nothing, but that is for another seminar. Now, what's remarkable is that if we discuss royalties, the differences are much bigger. And once again, Australia has different ways depending on the state, but it's a country that has high royalties compared to the international context. But this shows here that we have not been able to be similar enough. And this adds a few dimensions to the discussion. Nobody can assume that it's going to be much more and it's going to be reducing the GDP, a few GDP points. But I believe this is where the pending discussion lies in Chile. So with this, let me tell you that the discussion is a little bit disorganized, is making some progress, but it's disorganized because the diagnostic is not ready. A lot of work has been done. There are papers that look up backwards and figure out the income, and after paying a fair retribution to capital, and Studia et al. Paper that I criticized in a column, and I was beaten through Twitter later on because of my comments. But I believe it's outside the range that I believe is right. They talked about that more than 150 billion were collected between 2005 and 14, and only 27% for the state. The paper, which is very different, it's a paper that looks forward, that tries to look for the effective taxation rate that Jim mentioned from EY, in which it was 19% in 2011. It was low, we had a problem, and that's why we see these numbers. But forward is 43.4. That number, I don't believe this. It's just as I don't believe Sturla because of some more technical reasons, but it's not a well thought out taxation. Sometimes what you see here, you don't have the first category credits. No miner would actually take the money out, according to this, to be fair to both sides. Leiva published a paper. He's a young guy. He says that they are slightly lower than this because he actually reaches 161 billion, 37% for the state, and he looks at each mining company and he talks about a significant heterogeneity. Alejandra, I know I'm exceeding my time, but there's significant heterogeneity between deposits, and that's something that is not present in public discussion, and it's very important for the design of the taxation system. And a good paper that Sergio Jorat has published, that I believe is the one that is closest to reality. He talks about 120 billion of income for the period in which Sturla says almost 160. He says 40% goes to the state in Chile, or has gone to the state, and that 40%, that's Jim said, could be a little bit more, but we are within ballpark, I would say. So for you to have an idea, the cost all in that he calculates is 2.7 in 2019. So 2.7 of price, there's no income for mining in Chile. So this is what I wanted to tell you about this lack of diagnostic. And my second point is that we need to continue to build a shared diagnostic, and for that we need transparency. In the last few years, I believe communication has been very poor in telling that taxation or collection is almost zero. That's not right. In the end, they have actually recanted. They say, in fact, the only one that has been transparent is the mining companies. The Consejo Minero has made an effort of showing when the regimes or variability will cease. But the state, I believe, is completely indebted in terms of transparency. Finally, in terms of instruments, and I'm closing with this, I'd like to just mention that we need to discuss so much more. We have a problem, which is what is called hold up. Ulysses actually tied himself to the mast so that when the sirens, he would not go crazy. Here, we need to have a similar system that will not be decree 600, but we need systems that will leave us rest assured so that when something happens, we will not start the discussion then. And we have a problem with our mining taxes. If the prices go higher, we will not see so much collection because you need a $7 price. Maybe Goldman Sachs is right to really see collection that is important. So we need to discuss more with data and with considering heterogeneity. And I think it's worthwhile to broaden the discussion. Jim mentioned several things. Engel and Fisher in Chile have proposed net present value valuation, and the Guzman said let's go to Harberger tax, which is a percentage of the worth of the mining company, but at the same time issues. But somebody can buy that operation. That's more theoretical. Maybe that could be applied to water. I told Andrea, but I believe we need to discuss some more in terms of how we connect to these instruments. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Rodrigo.
Thank you, Rodrigo. You went over 3 minutes, but thank you. Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. And now I'd like to offer the floor to Caule Sangüesa.
Hi there. Good morning. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this interesting seminar. I essentially wanted to talk about 3 key aspects. One, provide an assessment or review of the debate currently taking place in Chile today. Secondly, I would like to refer to some science that has been employed. And then finally, an opinion, my perspective on the constitutional aspect specifically. So today, there are several debates that are overlapping today in Chile. There was one debate or one discussion that took place prior to the social crisis or social unrest and the pandemic with regard to the balance between the public and private sector with regard to the copper mining industry, and also how fair is the tax revenue applied to that income from that sector. That was one discussion. And then there's yet another discussion, which is more situational as related to the current crisis. This is a more global international debate related to who, in the end, will be financing this social unrest or crisis, and how much, as a result of that discussion, how much would the mining sector contribute to this. And then also, this is in addition to the expectations related to a potential super cycle in the future, because we know that the price has been forecast to increase. And then we have this other aspect related to structural aspects, but I would have to say that's a more practical discussion. Now, in the past, there was a structural debate that was more in the air, but today the structural debate could actually lead to legislative changes or constitutional changes. Essentially, those are the 3 debates or discussions that I see are taking place today. Now, with regard to the science, the scientific evidence, this is based on certain key facts, of course, science. Now, in Chile, I think it would be beyond the fact unnecessary to mention how important copper is in Chile. Chile provides 30% of the global copper production, and 50% of Chile's exports actually come from the copper industry. So clearly, in practical terms, copper is very important to Chile. Although it is also important in political, social realms. For example, Chile has a past that dates back to, for example, the end of the 60s, early 70s, when we saw that the copper industry was nationalized. And from those years, moving forward into the 90s, the private copper industry accounted for 10 to 20% of the national production. However, from 1990 going forward to 2000, the private mining companies increased their share from roughly 20 to 60% of the national production. And today, the state-owned production is roughly a third of national production. So there's an issue there that is on the discussion table. And I think this is also related to the previous discussion. That is, who it's important for those exploiting the copper resources to give back to the state and have it be fair for all and do this through a mining royalty. Now, Chile is part of the 80% of the key copper producing markets, and Price Waterhouse has said that Chile is part of this 80% of the countries that do actually have a tax on mining. However, we also know that it's within this 20% that does not actually charge a sales tax. And that is generally what is charged in other places. And on average, that royalty mining survey states that 4.9% roughly, that is according to the data under that study, 4.9% Chile, 2% Brazil, 3.5% Australia, and South Africa is 7%. US 5%. So when facing that evidence, we have to ask ourselves, would it be appropriate to apply a royalty or a sales tax? And that's what the Congress is discussing. Actually, the lower chamber adopted this already. And finally, there's this other concept, this idea with regard to how much is the state actually benefiting from the industry. The paper that Rodrigo also cited refers to a series of authors, Benjamin Leiva, for example, which is actually related to the 2020 study. And Benjamin says that from up until 2008, the state only received 40% of the mining income, and 60% went to the private industry. If we compare those to the other estimates that Jim mentioned, he mentions that perhaps the 2014 tax reform actually corrected that misalignment in Chile, but nonetheless, there is still some more progress to be made. With regard to the Constitution, I agree with Rodrigo, and actually we co-wrote a chapter in a book, and we referred to how the 80s Constitution, the 1980 Constitution, is very similar in wording to the 71 constitutional reform, where it states, the only thing it states is the same word. It says the state has absolute, exclusive, inalienable dominion on all mines, and that the law will determine what substances will be placed under concession, and the law also will ensure protecting the concessionaire's rights. And that's all dates back to the 71 reform. And in that regard, there really shouldn't be any radical change. And the same constitution today states that the mining constitution makes it mandatory for the concessionaire to carry out the necessary activities to facilitate public interest in order to justify the concession having been granted. That's in constitutional wording in terms. However, today we have a greater, loftier challenge, I would have to say, that is related to what Jim mentioned, and that is the environmental aspect and this concept of centralization or retribution for the communities where the deposits are being exploited. And I think there, the law and constitution will most likely set up environmental protection restrictions. And the law most likely should go in that direction as well. That is, have the provide regulations and restrictions that would ensure adequate exploitation, adequate mining that will also provide retribution to the communities. And then also, we know that there are demands, there are voices requiring that the state play a greater role in production and investment, because this could potentially alter Chile's key role in other products downstream. So that's also a discussion that focuses on how Chile could develop a side industry associated with the natural resources. Thank you, Claudia. You have reached your time limit. Thank you very much. I think I went over 1 minute. That's fine. We are caught up. Thank you so much, Claudia. Now I would like to invite Ben Jones. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Alejandra, and thanks to everyone for their insights so far, and particularly to Jim. Lots of interesting issues discussed there. The debate's quite broad, and I'm conscious of time, so perhaps I'll restrict my comments principally to issues relating to tax. There's a fairly vibrant debate emerging around the world concerning the level and structure of taxation on the mining and extractive sectors, but also more broadly on the corporate sector in the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis. And I think this debate, is really healthy, and it reflects, some pretty deep questions around long-term burden sharing, fiscal rules, and the role of the mining sector within that. So, we've heard quite clearly from around the virtual room that there's a pretty vibrant debate in Chile and among some stakeholders to the industry that perhaps the industry should pay more, particularly the larger players, and make a more stable contribution over the cycle. Now, I don't want to get involved in making normative statements around these kind of value sharing discussions. It's not the sort of thing that we at CIU opine on. So I'll sort of restrict my comments to a more sort of technical and evidential basis. Clearly, as we all know, Chile's been a real pioneer in orientating its fiscal regime around a profit base, and I think we're all familiar, with the theory that says that profit rather than production-based levies have the potential to create stronger incentives for investment and sustainable resource development. Now, talking to some of our research, I think that suggests that this theory is also likely to have played out in practice. So, for example, I undertook a study with my team in partnership with the IDB and Professor Graham Davis from Colorado School of Mines. Really sophisticated piece of work. I'd sort of commend you all, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, to take a good look. It covered a whole gamut of fiscal levies and looked, in quite a lot of detail about how they impacted operational and investment decisions across a large sample of mines drawn from across the Latin American region. And, in the context of that study, we found that the regime in Chile, as it bore on selected copper mines, for example, resulted in very low tax distortions. So fundamentally strong incentives to invest and grow. So I think that message that, the regime is fundamentally healthy, is very much upheld in that study. But as we all know, efficiency isn't everything. So in terms of the distribution of value between the various stakeholders to the industry, we found that, in an assessment of essentially the effective government take that Jim spoke about, that fell roughly in the region of 40 to 50% that Jim spoke of, for the mines that we looked into. But that being said, so I don't think there's a fundamental problem to fix on the basis of that evidence. But relative to some of the other mines in other countries that we explored, it was probably marginally at the lower end of our sample range. There are many measures with which you can think about the quality and efficacy of a tax regime. I've mentioned a couple. But one of Jim's messages that I very much agree with is on the importance of sensitizing the performance of your tax regime under different market and cost assumptions. So if we were to take kind of the top line, the price environment, for example, we found that the government share for the mines studied in Chile was probably stable across a range of prices, but probably not rising. So probably not progressive, you know, in the sense that the government takes a rising share as overarching profitability rises. And that was by no means uncommon. In fact, for I think the 5 or 6 countries that were covered in that study, I don't think I found any that was universally progressive in terms of that rising share. But still, it's a point I think worth making. So I guess just sort of thinking forward, it's not for me to say whether it's the right time for tax reform, but rather to counsel, very much in line with one of Jim's key messages, that in the event of any reform process, that this be undertaken with, you know, real care and attention, and that any reforms be informed and supported by, you know, an appropriate level of analysis, right? You know, one of the takeaways from our study was that, you know, the tax policy handbook that's so favored by policymakers offers actually quite a partial view of the world. So in order to understand tax incidence, which is very heterogeneous in the work that we've done, and I think that's a message that comes out from Rodrigo's talk as well, you really need to understand how the tax base will behave in response to whatever tax policy formulation you choose going forward. And that's by no means simple to ascertain, and it's well worth taking time to think it through on a technical and a political basis. And I'll leave you with an example on this. You know, we looked at 2 different iron mines in Brazil, same industry, broadly the same fiscal regime, but with different scales and cost structures, right? So in that case, we found enormous differences in the size of the tax distortion across these assets. And that was largely a function of the different behavioral responses. So the more flexibility that was, you know, available to the larger players in particular means that, you know, some tax structures can be fundamentally more inefficient for those larger sections of the industry that actually may be the target of the current political discussion. So I think there's a little bit of a warning note there. You know, I guess the one observation on this conversation is that, you know, the measure of value sharing is relatively narrow. And I think one of the things that often gets missed from the political and technical discussion, and at least in significant part due to measurement issues, concerns the sort of role of broader economic linkages. You know, we know very well that Chile has a hugely long and well-developed copper value chain, which extends all the way to the manufacture and servicing of key technical factor inputs, right? So these, to my mind at least, these backward linkages probably aren't sufficiently well recognized in the context of many of these burden sharing and sector policy reform discussions. You know, again, we've done our best to try and sort of break ground in this area. You know, we've developed a new measure for host country cash flow, which captures the value of all these domestic expenditures throughout the supply chain. You know, and I can't talk to specific work in Chile, but if I think of, you know, analysis we've undertaken on other major sort of greenfield projects elsewhere in Latin America, you know, we found that the value of these backward linkages is, you know, at least as big, if not an order of magnitude greater than the direct fiscal payments. So when you think about the totality of the burden sharing, I think if you consider these linkages, you get potentially quite an adjusted view, and one that's potentially more favorable in Chile than perhaps other parts of the world. So I'm going to keep my comments fairly short for now, but I'll pass back to the floor.
Thank you, Ben. Muchas gracias, Ben, por tu interesante.
Thank you, Ben, for your interesting contribution. And finally, for this first round, I would like to give the floor to Juan Ignacio Guzman. Thank you, Alejandra. First of all, allow me to thank Cesco for inviting me to take part in this panel. And as usual, I would like to thank Jim for his very wise words of wisdom and the other panelists for their interesting remarks. Allow me to refer to three aspects that, in my opinion, must be included in this discussion that will be taking place over the next few weeks and few months in Chile, both with regard to the Constitution and with regard to the congressional aspects. The first of these issues is the historic contribution of the mining industry, in keeping with the constitutional system that we have in place today, because obviously we are considering changing this. But the first question we need to ask ourselves is, well, what is the review of the current system? Have we conducted a review of the mining sector's contribution to Chile, or have we not? We need to establish a baseline in order to address the future. Over the last 30 years, the mining sector, I would have to say, has been the key driving force behind the economy and economic development, contributing roughly 20% of the GDP, both directly and indirectly. That is, that figure refers to direct and indirect contributions. So the two top industries in the economy are in our country contribute that 20%. I'm referring direct mining contribution and associated sector contribution. So roughly 50% of Chile's exports are also tied to the mining industry. So from an economic perspective, there's absolutely no doubt that the mining industry has made a significant contribution to the country's development. Now, often what we forget to refer to is the mining sector's contribution socially and environmentally to Chile. Specifically, with regard to the social contribution, mining has made it possible for a large number of communities and regions that in the past were left to their own devices, today now have significant development levels and better quality of life that actually one could say on average are better than the other regions where there is not a significant mining contribution. And this, of course, has been materialized in terms of infrastructure, local development, or social plans that actually have been carried out, drafted and carried out, implemented by the mining companies in keeping with their policies of having sustainable mining operations and to be sustainable with regard to the communities where they work. From the 70s to the 90s in Chile, the mining industry, or Chile dropped its poverty rates from 40 to 10%. Now, obviously, we cannot lose from sight when discussing constitutional replacement or reform, because the experience that we have had actually is an exemplary experience for the rest of the world. Now, the question is, can we make it even better? Well, that perhaps is where we need to begin this discussion. But we cannot lose from sight all of the contribution that is made thus far. It is valuable. It's helpful for this discussion. And now we need to perhaps change the discussion and figure out what's next. That's why I've really enjoyed listening to the other panelists who have mentioned we do not believe in major constitutional change because the system thus far, in essence, has been around for 100 years, actually 100 years. And from that perspective, that tradition, that culture that we have developed as part of this whole ecosystem is something that would have to change too if we are going to expect different results. And we have to assess whether or not the Constitution has been it's made a contribution in this regard, and figure out what comes next. Should we continue moving forward with the status quo or make changes, regardless of how in-depth these may be? But just let me make it clear that we cannot ignore the contribution made by the mining industry to the country in keeping with the current system and the various changes that have been applied to said system over the years. Secondly, allow me to refer to another key issue that I think is central to this discussion, and I'm referring to taxes and royalties and how these have an impact on investments and in the mining industry and the competitiveness. Now, Rodrigo referred to the impact of using a tax or a royalty on other aspects that actually go beyond the mining income. For example, it would be applied to net profit. And if that were the case, the company would have no reason to be. Now, that clearly would provide us with a windfall today, but zero in the future. And you simply cannot draft a constitution only on today's circumstances, but rather you need to focus on the future. And I believe that is a key aspect. I think that goes to the heart of part of this debate. If we're going to have a debate based on, it's a situational debate based on today, well, really, our hands would be tied because we would end up just where we are. We need to focus on a contribution that will be a social contract that will be governing the country, perhaps for the next 50 years. Now, what about the royalty or a tax on income by public and private mining companies? Well, over the last 20 years, this has been broken down to three key aspects. First of all, it's really been a reflection of the exceptional quality of resources that we have here in Chile. Our mines back in the 90s were actually much better than they are than the rest of the world. That's on the one hand. And then there was this external shock in China, unrelated to Chile, that resulted in exponential growth in commodities, including copper and lithium, which obviously constitute the two main mining industries in Chile. And then thirdly, there's an institutional basis or system that was working quite well. I think we need to call a spade a spade. Of course, there are opportunities for improvement, but the institutional arrangements have worked well. And some of the authors mentioned by Rodrigo referred to how this has enabled the country to collect 40% of the country's revenue over the last 20 years. That's a significant figure, I'd have to say. And that's apart from the economic earnings or income. There's another contribution made by the mining industry, which is 2 to 3 times that value if you take into consideration all the other pieces of the puzzle. We know that the industry's payments are specifically related to what the industry pays out. But when one refers to that, they don't really refer to the benefits reaped by the workers or the other ecosystems surrounding the mining industry. So the social contribution of the industry, the private industry, is 2 to 3 times. And let's just not focus on this 40% economic contribution. If the mining industry weren't around, we would have not taken advantage of this. And so it's important to focus on what we would not have reaped had the mining industry not been the way it is. And we know that the future will bring about change. That's obvious. We know that the quality of the resources are not the same today as they were 20 years ago, and 20 years forward, they will be much worse than they are today. China continues to show significant growth, and electromobility seems to appear as a key factor in future demand. 2 minutes, by the way, and institutional arrangements or systems and the structure today is under fire. Therefore, we need to ensure that the institutional arrangements are such that they will be able to address the drop in grade and the decrease in competitiveness. We do not want what happened to nitrate industry, saltpeter industry to occur to the copper industry. We don't want that. We don't want to repeat history. We know what happened with the saltpeter industry and then synthetic examples. If you look into history, you will see that that was the #1 product exported by Chile back in the day. And the Chilean state, even though the state knew it was a successful product comedy, the state started applying higher and higher taxes onto nitrates or saltpeter. And as a result, the product became increasingly more expensive in the international market. And that in turn resulted in this disincentive for the Chilean market, but incentive for the rest because they came up with a synthetic nitrate. And so it's sort of the example of slaughtering your golden goose, right? So that brings me to the royalty issue. On the one hand, you have the specific mining tax, and then you have royalties. I think they're two different worlds. Royalties play a key role in terms of preserving the natural wealth in Chile. Every ton of copper or lithium extracted from the ground no longer exists for the future, for future benefit. So if the company extracts it, will the company be losing money by extracting it, by mining it? Well, that's the company's issue. But I think we need to take in consideration the opportunity cost for Chile of not mining that ton, not extracting that ton. And this concept of royalties is essential. I do believe that without a doubt, we need to provide incentive for that so that we can maintain, preserve the national wealth. We know how important royalties are in our industry and in other industries. When you have a renewable resource, there's no opportunity cost there. So, but when you don't, it's key to focus on royalties and focus on a discussion that will address the instrument and how the instrument will provide funds and how those funds will be used. Now, in keeping with a draft bill, those funds cannot be used for situational expenses. We all regret the pandemic, obviously, but the royalty cannot be used to alleviate the pandemic issue. The pandemic issue needs to be addressed by sovereign funds or other funds, other mechanisms. And Chileans across the board, those of us who will be living here in this country in 50 years' time, we need to have the same level of wealth in terms of national capital or equivalent to what we are enjoying today. Because we, over the last 30 years, have enjoyed this national development thanks to that natural capital. But it is waning. It is becoming depleted over time. So it's essential for the royalty to be reinvested in development or in part to geological exploration so that we can increase the pot of natural resources so that we can either renew these or renovate and refurbish technology that will allow us to increase our reserves. Thank you. I'm wrapping up. And all of this will allow for Chile, not the mining industry, but Chile, to better use, better tap the resources. And in doing so, the mining district plays a key role. The mining is not our enemy. This is a shared business opportunity. And obviously there is room for all as long as we have the right instruments like we have in the past, but we need to make sure that the instruments are in keeping with change. Thank you, Juan Ignacio. And all the other panelists. Thank you for this first round of remarks. Prior to going on to the second, I would just like to remind you that remind the audience that you can send your questions to the WhatsApp appearing on the screen. Please be sure to state your name and organization you represent. And now, allow me to invite Jim to join the discussion. And first, I will give you all 5 minutes to refer to how you think we can move toward having a shared assessment review of the current situation and the current controversy and how this can be carried out in a heated scenario with regard to the debate in terms of use it or lose it, as mentioned by Jim, and also the example of intergenerational sovereign fund that would collect a royalty, also as proposed by Jim. Now, let me now give the floor to Jim. And Jim, please refer a bit more in your 5 minutes to refer to the backward linkages that Ben Jones mentioned. I think that's a very interesting topic. Thank you. And Jim, the floor is yours.
Okay. I guess one of the big questions I have is, why are people in Chile so dissatisfied with what they have? Chile's moved into being the wealthiest country in South America. It's a high income country. It's benefited greatly from the copper industry, but still a lot of social unrest, demands for a new constitution. So I think I and a lot of people outside of Chile are very curious about what's causing this social unrest. Is it income distribution problems? Is it dissatisfaction with the way government is run? I don't know. But when we think about the copper industry, does it need to be affected at all by these changes that are taking place? To what extent does the population think that copper is the solution or copper is the problem? Now, when we think about the Constitution, it doesn't say a lot about natural resources. It's like most constitutions. It's got a few lines in there that are pretty key, but they don't tell you how to regulate, for the most part, the industry. And so when the Constitution changes, is that going to drive a whole set of other regulatory changes in the tax system, maybe in the mining law, in the organic mining law? We don't know. But certainly we do know that there are certain aspects of the way that the mining industry is regulated in Chile that aren't working so well. A lot of it's working great, but there are some things that could be improved. So this may present a very big opportunity to try to modernize the system. It's 40 years old, and there are whole portions of it that are just out of date. Exploration reporting, for example, an accessible cadastre tied to a system that has geologic information. Even the poorest countries nowadays have this, and Chile doesn't. So there's a lot of ways it could be improved. How do you go about doing that improvement? Well, in many countries, you start with a very detailed analysis of the whole regulatory structure. You go through each aspect of the mining law and the regulations to see what's working, what's not working. And then you have a public debate around it. You have a roadshow, you go around and you talk to the population and say, what do you think? Would this be a good change? Is it working well? And you get views from a whole variety of stakeholders before you sit down and begin drafting a bunch of changes in the legal system or in the fiscal system. With regard to linkages, economic linkages, most of the mining codes that I assisted in drafting over the past, say 15 years, all require economic linkages, forward and backward. In terms of taking a look at inputs, many mining codes require that goods and services, that there's a plan that has to be implemented over time to make sure you're maximizing the use of local goods and services all along the value chain. It's not a mandate that you must do this, you must do that, but you must have a plan how you will use local goods and services. And so there are sets of metrics are set up within the mining law to encourage those economic linkages. And as Ignacio said, the economic multiplier effect from mining is often overlooked. There's often a focus just on tax, but the economic multiplier, those benefits it can greatly outweigh fiscal benefits. And I think that that's very important to mention. I think that's all. That's probably my 5 minutes, huh?
Sí. Yes, muchas gracias, Jim. Ahora me gustaría dar la palabra.
Thank you, Jim. Now I'd like to offer the floor to Pilar Asbun. Thank you, Alejandra.
Thank you, Alejandra, and others for your interesting remarks. First of all, I agree with Juan Ignacio. And it's nice to know that there's a certain amount of consensus, a certain amount of feeling today that the economic basis could be maintained and sustained during these constitutional changes. Maybe we know that there may be new obligations for the concession holders, but basically the essential rules of the game would stay in place if there is consensus, and that provides us with a certain degree of peace of mind. And then, of course, let me refer to the royalty discussion. First of all, our starting point should be that today there is a draft bill in the Congress that defines a royalty of 3% ad valorem royalty on copper and lithium extracted products. And this bill is unconstitutional because it's referring to the exclusive power of the president today to apply taxes. This is a discussion that is moving forward, and it's in the Mining and Energy Commission of the Chamber of Deputies, by the way. So now, having said that, now, obviously there's a debate with regard to the royalty. This will occur, but I think that this should be a serious debate. And if we are to have a serious debate, we must not forget that there's a specific tax on mining. It's a progressive tax, dates back to 2005, and then 2010, the tax was increased. The tax rate, as I said, is progressive, and this progressive tax is unique in that it allows for the state to receive more revenue during boom times. I don't think we should lose that from sight, because also when the specific mining tax was processed, it was based on the same royalty arguments, based on this concept that they're taxing non-renewable resources. So as a result, you need to protect them. Therefore, I believe that prior to defining whether or not we are going to change the tax structure, we need to have studies on this. I agree that the state also needs to become more transparent with regard to the figures that are applicable to mining tax and mining revenue. And then the Mining Council also mentioned that it's important to determine when the contracts, concessions of several of the key companies are reaching their term. Thank you. Thank you, Pilar. Now let me give the floor to Rodrigo Valdez. Let me first answer Jim's question. Jim, it's very difficult to have a precise assessment of why we are in the situation we are in Chile today. I think this is a brave new world for all of us, in fact. And at the same time, there's a great opportunity here because our social contract, I think, was worn and torn, and we have an opportunity to do something different and better. Of course, there's risk therein, no doubt about that. Now, with regard to other issues and the mining sector debate, I think we need to have a more forward-looking approach instead of based on the past. Let's not go back to 2007 and what the situation was, a tax regime. That's done and over with. That was then, this is now. Therefore, I think it's essential to gather more information, as we've said. And I trust in rational thought. So the more information we have, the more discussion we'll have, more debates such as this one. And I think that all will be a significant contribution. Now, specifically regarding Alejandra's question, I really like this concept of use it or lose it. I think that we do have a problem there, and it goes beyond the mining sector. I think it has to do with this, I guess, hoarding, if you will, of license permits of this type to charge others who want to do other things on your land. That's an issue. I think that will change in that realm, will be very challenging. But I do believe, I'm practically 100% sure that we won't have so many constitutional contributions in terms of quotas. There will be a few, but I think it'll be easier because of that. It'll be easier to make change. With regard to this, a fund, a special fund, that I think that's appropriate when you have a lot of revenue. The intergenerational fund in Norway is logical. I think that is appropriate for us to, for discussion purposes, for example, so that we can determine when to produce and when, and that relationship with when to spend. So people say, no, we need to be slower with regard to how we develop the mining industry and save some for the future. No, that's not what I think. We need to develop and produce when the money is right and make sure that the profit and the revenue is distributed accordingly. So given the size of revenue from the mining industry, the mines here in Chile today, this conversation with regard to the sovereign wealth fund, I think, is more related to macroeconomic short-term aspects than related to squirreling away so many resources for my grandchildren. Thank you for that, Rodrigo. Now, let me give the floor to Claudia Sanhueza.
Well, thank you again. And I wanted to start mentioning Jim's question, and I agree with the fact that we would have to hold another seminar to be able to answer it. But I just wanted to venture a comment about one of the possible factors involved, and one has to do with what he presented as a proposal, which is the share or the participation or involvement of communities and the people in the decision-making process of political institutions, of the different agents and corporations. I believe that is something important where we could make some progress. And what you mentioned about actually, there are some companies, some countries that inform their citizens. In New Zealand, for example, very interesting. Not long ago, I saw issues related to central bank, which seem to be so abstract, but there are consultations among the citizens, which are more participatory processes, and I believe that's something that we need to make some progress in. Also, with other proposals such as involvement of the workers themselves, we've heard lately here in the public debate in terms of workers being part of the boards of directors of the companies. I believe we need to discuss a lot about this in order to understand where this is coming from. And I also wanted to discuss the other proposals that we heard about the fund itself. In fact, the Social and Economic Stabilization Fund in Chile that seemed a funding source, for example, to be used in the current crisis, is approximately 5% of the GDP. And that has been set up using the royalty that was implemented, and it may be even larger and more important, play a more important role, such as in the case of Norway, or which is a different order of magnitude, of course, I understand. But anyway, it is a way of maybe saving those resources and leave them for the future generations. And finally, this idea of use it or lose it, I believe this is also connected with the debate about water here in Chile, which is another right, and that's also under that kind of proposal, use it or lose it, and the issue of adjusting in order to leverage this. When the prices are high versus when there are low prices, being able to adjust to according to those cycles. If I understood well, it would be interesting to delve deeper into that topic just right now, because it seems there's a super cycle coming in adjust this in order to leverage that and maybe save it in this intergenerational fund. Thank you, Claudia. I'd like to offer the floor to Ben Jones now.
Thanks, Alejandra. Yeah, so maybe just a few brief reflections. So I think the use it or lose it idea is certainly a very interesting one to explore. I think the example that Jim gave of the South African case, where reform of the rules affecting this hoarding behavior were quite instrumental in supporting an expansion of, for example, the manganese industry in particular. I think the evidence for that is quite strong. I guess an observation there is that those rules were only part of the fix. The world's inevitably a complex place, and in that particular context, I think co-reform of structural issues pertaining to transportation, particularly rail freight, were also quite instrumental. So it'll be important to consider the other constraints to industry expansion here in Chile and think about how they potentially interact with some of these other reforms. On the sovereign wealth / stabilization fund, it's a very interesting area. My feeling is that probably the debate warrants a slightly sharper focus on the distinction between sort of managing volatility and managing much longer term intergenerational equity issues, and they're quite different. And I think the public finance literature is quite clear on that. I think again the practicalities are a little different in the sense that being able to distinguish the two at the coalface is quite difficult. And having been an IMFer myself, trying to work out what's going on the ground when things are complex, I can attest to that myself. So having a sort of a clear set of multiple funds targeted at different goals, and having a clear set of indicators that mark one goal for one allocation versus another allocation against another goal. So I think those rules warrant some pretty close scrutiny and careful thought, I think, which is inevitably the case. On the tax and royalty debate, again, it's a very complicated area, and it's pretty sensitive. Let's just call that out now. There are huge information asymmetries here. The industry knows a great deal more about the effective burden than policymakers. That's inevitably the case. So investment in bridging those gaps is money well spent, potentially, I would argue. There's a vast amount of heterogeneity out there, which is a point that's already been made. I think here, though, it's sort of important to take a holistic view of the burden, right? So Pilar's made the point that we've got this progressive SMT, but the aggregate impacts of the fiscal burden under our analysis are not progressive, right? That's our view. And unless you take a view of the asset, the divvy taxes, the royalty, and the profit-based levies, unless you take that comprehensively view, you can't really make a judgment. So I would sort of really commend, the community of stakeholders in this game to invest in information and to take a broad view on what constitutes an effective burden on the industry, and to do it in a very granular way, because frankly, the point's been made, how a new reform lands on a representative miner, it's almost meaningless, right? For the marginal guy that's put out of business because there is a highly distortionary 3% ad valorem levy, it's a completely different picture from the guy in the first or the second quartile that's going to be highly profitable regardless under most plausible cost and price scenarios. So it's really a process that I think will take time, and it's when you make the right investment, they pay off, but they take time to distill and disseminate. So I think it's a cautionary word, really.
Gracias, Ben. Muy interesante. Me gustaría ahora pasar.
Thank you, Ben. That's very interesting. Now let me give the floor to Juan Ignacio, specifically with regard to Ben's remarks. I would like your perspective with regard to what I mentioned at the beginning. How do you think we could move forward with regard to conducting a shared assessment, and what do you think the role of the industry would be in this process? And how can we do this given the challenging political situation we're experiencing? Well, no, I think the purpose of the shared assessment that Rodrigo referred to is absolutely essential. We need to sit down at the same table with a variety of different stakeholders from industry, academia, communities, etc., and have a discussion, a dialogue that is really based on a country perspective, because there's obviously the overarching purpose, which is to benefit Chile. Now, the industry players know that they cannot operate in a country that is not doing well, that is not solid or stable. So we're all truly interested in Chile's welfare. And I think when we sit down to have a debate from that approach, this will bring about an appropriate assessment. And we also need to make sure that all of the individuals seated at the table discussing are not competing with each other for Chile's welfare, but rather we are cooperating, not competing, cooperating towards finding the best possible formula that we can all apply to bring out the best from Chile and for Chile. So I think that's what we need to do. We need to have the best possible willingness to do that. And I think organizations such as Cesco, and as an independent entity, definitely needs to play a role here. But likewise, industry, academia, the state, and other stakeholders truly need to reflect upon this aspect. Now, with regard to your second comment or question, use it or lose it, I fully agree with the purpose of that. Granting a concession for something that's not going to be used really makes no sense. Now, I would just say one caveat here. Let's make sure we understand how we're applying this concept, because unfortunately, mining legislation, it's not enough to make sure that it's all fine and dandy in spirit. I think the spirit of the concept of use it or lose it is not in discussion. The issue is, how can we come up with the right instrument to make sure that this is correctly rolled out? And today, when you read the mine code, at first glance, it would seem as though this proper spirit essence is therein. However, the laws do not follow suit. So we need to have a debate that is based on quality. And in practice, we need to make sure that the right outcome is attained. Now, with regard to the royalty aspects, let me refer to something interesting. Now, this specific tax on mining, in my opinion, is not a royalty. It's essentially a tax paid by the mining industry as part of its contribution to the state, and the state as the owner of the resources. And obviously the state as owner wants to enjoy in the profit, take part in the profit. One could also say, okay, you across the board, you want to take part in the profits, you also need to take part in the losses. But regardless of that, we need to mention that the state is providing the resource and would like to have additional benefit, additional retribution for having contributed this natural capital above and beyond standard income tax, correct? I think that's appropriate. Now, should we have a more progressive approach than what we have today? That is precisely what we need to figure out by way of a shared assessment. And we need to do this carefully in a well thought out process. And I think that has been remarked upon several times in this event. We need to consider carefully how this is carried out, when as well, so that these new instruments respond to the spirit, the essence of the purpose of the concept, and in practical terms. Finally, allow me to remark upon the royalty. Now, Rodrigo, I disagree with you on an intellectual level in that we are not a rich country, and we cannot ignore the future of our grandchildren. I disagree with you. So the way I view it, royalties are the pension system of the mining system. What do I mean by that? When the mining industry is no longer there, when it withdraws from the economy, if you will, or retires, one could say, the royalty will be the pension system. providing a pension to the state, if you will. Now, if we apply this algorithm that shows that, okay, we're not a wealthy country, then you should save money for your future, for your old age, we would all benefit from that. Now, perhaps I misunderstood this argument. I thought I understood. We're not rich, so we shouldn't focus on saving the future. I think that's incorrect. I think money can contribute to the present through income tax or specific tax or all the various instruments in existence. But let's not forget that the country must try to hold on to this long-term perspective and leave behind a pension as a legacy, as a support for the future when it's no longer there. At some point in time, the mining industry will, quote unquote, retire. So the question is, when will that occur? I don't know. Should we just ignore all of this? I don't think we should. I think we should. When the mining industry is retiring, the generations then and there will say, how come our grandparents didn't make plans for us? They took advantage of the wealth and the richness over as stated in the history books, but how come they didn't leave anything behind for us? So I think what we need to do is take advantage of this moment and come up with a 21st century modern constitution that really delves into these aspects. Thank you. Alejandro, if you would allow me to point out something, how I was, quote unquote, subject to an attack. No, I'm just kidding. Let me make something very clear. When we have sovereign funds, correct? I think it's odd to have that when our public debt is growing and growing. It's contradictory. So of course, leaving funds for our grandchildren in a sovereign fund that is 3 times what we have today, and then we have public debt at the same time, that's tricky. So if you want to refer to intergenerational funds, you shouldn't refer to the gross funds that are there. I don't think that's useful. I agree with regard to sustainability. We need to ensure that the Constitution refers to aspects that go far and beyond environmental aspects. We have social sustainability. We have fiscal sustainability. There are many facets of sustainability that we need to address. And it's very interesting to see how today we are concerned, we have 2 different tangents. One is focusing on fiscal and environmental sustainability and the other social sustainability. So it's challenging. Thank you, Rodrigo.
Había malentendido entonces.
Sí, no, yo seguro.
Oye, bueno, vamos a pasar rápidamente porque ya estamos pasados 4 minutos, pero quiero ser justa con nuestro público.
I'd like to be fair with our audience because they've sent us a number of questions. I will go quickly through 2 of them, one for Jim and one for the Chilean members of our panel. Jim, I have a question about your opinion about the effect of the change in concessions or licenses in South Africa. What was the impact of that change?
Well, as Ben mentioned, the use it or lose it principle when it was came into effect, it was part of a whole variety of other reforms. But the main impact is that all these areas that were locked up by just a few companies did become available for exploration. And you had a lot more players come in to do exploration. Now, there were other factors there that may have retarded investment into the country. There was a lot of other sorts of instability that were a disincentive to investment. But certainly with regard to exploration, it was highly successful. Many new players, ground that would not be developed for 20 or 30 years was on the table, and I have to say that that was probably one of the most successful parts of the reform in South Africa, where the use it and lose it principles.
Muchas gracias, Jim. Y para todos
Thank you, Jim. And for all the Chilean panel members, what do you think? What do you think of Chile adhering to EITI? Maybe Pilar? Thank you, Alejandra. Just one thing before answering that question, I did not mean the use it or lose it during the first round of discussion. And without being an economist, I believe we can learn some lessons in terms learned from water, for example. If there would be too much speculation that may justify some kind of regulation reform, but that needs to be discussed and analyzed, of course, based on empirical evidence in the light of a compared experience, and also being careful, because if we progress to a system like that, that the criteria should be reflected in the law, that will provide the legal certainty that is required for investors. And as to the question whether Chile should adhere to EIT, I believe it's a sensitive topic in this environment. Potentially that could be the case, but at the same time, there is enough information as well, and we have a lot to lose if we join. Personally, this is something that we need to be very serious about and discussing whether to adhere or not, because the context of countries that joined, this was thought for different types of countries where there was not much information available. So we would need to see if, in fact, the risks of joining or not maybe even higher than not joining. Thank you, Pilar. Rodrigo? I don't know enough about the principles and how they operate, so I wouldn't dare to say, let's embrace this and go forward. But let me give you my thought. Because sometimes we make mistakes when we sign some international agreements, and sometimes we're successful. I'd like to know who signs. If Canada, Australia are part of the signatories, I think I would need to think twice not to sign. But if you see maybe countries from South America or Africa, I would have to come up with a very good case in order for me to sign, for example. Thank you. Juan Ignacio? Juan Ignacio, are you there? Excuse me, I was muted. Okay, I think Pilar's and Rodrigo's answers are the ones we need. I think we need to study more. We need to, if Chile has not joined, is because of what Rodrigo just said. Jim or Ben, any comments, any reactions to the other panelists' responses in terms of why adhering or not? I believe Claudia, I'm sorry, Claudia, please, I'm sorry. Apologies, it doesn't matter, don't worry. I think what, at least the same response in terms of signing it. I agree with that, but by the way, I believe what Jim meant in terms of transparency and standards of information required from the industry and the organization of that information, I believe that it's something we should make progress in. And if we haven't signed that or joined, maybe adopting those transparency standards would be a great help in our debate. Thank you. Jim and then Ben. Any reaction to these remarks from the other panelists in terms of joining EITI?
Well, I don't see what the risks are from joining EITI. I think the risk is when the industry is perceived in the wrong way because the information that's available isn't readily accessible to the public. And that's part of what EITI is all about. It's a tripart approach with civil society, government, and companies coming together to decide what to report and in what form it will be reported. And it can be a very useful tool for allowing the public to understand the industry. Usually the fiscal stuff is out there. How much was paid, by whom, how was the money spent? That could go a long way to addressing a lot of these issues that come up again and again in Chile with regard to royalty. And it deals with governance issues that may be of public concern too. So I really don't see what the risk is. I see a lot of benefits there. And there's about 55 countries out there now that it's not like you have to make a big payment or you're going to be fined if you don't report. The downside is very small.
Ujú.
Maybe Ben would like to comment. He knows a lot about it.
Look, I don't have a huge amount to say at this stage, but my presumption is quite similar to yours, Jim, in the sense that I don't see a vast amount of downside. There are few teeth. There is quite a broad interpretation of the guidelines available to participating governments. I believe Australia isn't a signatory. Canada, I think, is. So I don't think there's, a clear kind of line to take from the sort of two leading jurisdictions, if you like. But I think it would be positive for the movement if an industry leader such as Chile joined.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Y bueno, la verdad.
Thanks, everybody. And really, we are, I think this is the end. We went beyond the time. It's been a couple of interesting hours. I'd like to thank Jim for your great talk and the rest of the panelists.
I would just like to briefly summarize the deliberations of today with regard to the need to invest in information to come up with a better assessment and share said assessment, make sure it's distributed appropriately between the state, academia, private sector, sundry stakeholders. Also, it's key to have a good discussion with regard to whether or not we need to boost the tax contribution of the mining industry. Also, we discussed the urgency of reviewing and revising the royalty tax situation, perhaps moving toward use it or lose it. We also talked about the significant impact of the mining industry on the rest of the economy in Chile. And also, we would like to invite all of you, the participants, to take part in this long-term discussion and accept the suggestion and or advice of our keynote speaker today when he said, don't jump to action. So allow me to bid you farewell and wish you a fabulous day, and we will be in touch soon. Thank you.